Under the crystal chandeliers of a private gala, champagne glasses froze mid-air. Scarlett Voss, the billionaire everyone feared, turned toward the quiet man at the far end of the table and smiled like a blade. "You don't belong here, Adrian. Failures don't sit with builders." Laughter rippled through the room. Adrian Cole did not argue. He set down his glass, stood up, and walked out without a single word. Years later, the doors of that same ballroom opened again, and the man who had been humiliated walked back in as its owner. On the evening of the gala, Adrian Cole was just another name on the quiet end of a fading invitation list. He lived in a small rental on the outskirts of the city, a place with thin walls and a radiator that rattled every winter. The envelope had arrived on a Tuesday, embossed with gold foil. The host was a mutual contact from his old days, someone who still remembered the version of Adrian that had existed before the collapse, before the press calls stopped, before the bank accounts emptied and the phone went silent for 7 months straight. He had almost thrown the invitation away. The gala was the kind of evening he used to walk into without thinking: marble lobbies, string quartets, $30 glasses of champagne handed out like candy. Now the thought of standing in that kind of room made his stomach turn. But he needed contacts. He needed to be seen by people who still had the money to move things. His second attempt at business was small, stitched together from consulting jobs and a half-finished product nobody had funded yet. Walking into the gala was a decision made out of necessity, not pride. He wore a suit that was 3 seasons old. The cuffs were clean, but the lining had begun to fray at the collar. On the taxi ride in, he rehearsed the names of people he might meet, the right sentences to open with the careful half-smile that had once been second nature. By the time the car pulled up to the glass entrance of the Westmore Hotel, his hands were cold and his jaw was tight. He handed the invitation to the doorman and walked inside without looking back. The ballroom opened like a cathedral of money. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling, painted in soft gold, and long tables lined the floor, set with white linen and low arrangements of roses. Waiters moved between guests with trays of champagne. Adrian found his name card at a side table far from the center, the kind of placement reserved for people who had been added as a favor. He sat down without complaint and watched the room settle into the slow choreography of polite networking. He did not notice Scarlett Voss when she entered. Almost no one did at first. She had the skill of appearing already in the middle of a conversation, as if she had been there all along. She moved through the ballroom, the way a current moves through water, drawing people toward her without effort. She wore black cut severely at the shoulders, with a single line of diamonds at her throat. Her voice was low, exact, amused, in a way that never reached her eyes. Within 10 minutes, she had owned the room, and the room seemed grateful for it. When she reached the table where Adrian was seated, she did not sit down. She stood at the head of it, one hand resting lightly on the back of an empty chair, and let her gaze drift over the guests the way a buyer looks over a lot at auction. Her eyes stopped on him. There was a small private change in her expression, recognition then something colder. She tilted her head slightly and spoke his name out loud, just his first name, in a voice that carried further than it needed to. Conversations around the table dimmed. Scarlett smiled the way she smiled in board meetings when she had already won. She asked loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear how his company was doing these days, whether it had found a second wind, or whether he was still selling off the furniture. Someone laughed, a short, nervous sound. Adrian set his glass down on the linen and met her eyes. He did not answer. He understood from the way she was standing that no answer he gave would land where it was meant to land. She reminded the table that Adrian had once run a company that collapsed in under 2 years, that investors had lost money, that his name had appeared in a trade journal under the word cautionary. She said all of this lightly with the tone of someone telling a mildly amusing anecdote. She finished by saying that failure was fine, of course as long as a man understood where he belonged afterward, and that some men simply did not belong at tables like this one. "Failures," she said. "Don't sit with builders." The laughter that came then was no longer nervous. It was confident, collective, the kind of sound a room makes when it has decided which way the power flows. Adrian felt the heat rise along the back of his neck. Every argument he could have made lined itself up in his head. The real reasons the company had failed the two partners who had walked out with the capital. The market shift no one had forecast, the 1,000 nights he had worked trying to keep the doors open. None of those reasons mattered in this room. In this room, there was only the verdict she had just delivered. He did not argue. He did not explain. He reached for the napkin in his lap, folded it once, and set it beside his plate. Then he stood up. His chair scraped the floor, a small sound, in a large room. He did not look at Scarlett. He did not look at the guests watching him. He walked the length of the ballroom at a steady pace, past the waiters, past the string quartet, and he pushed through the tall doors without slowing down. The air outside was cold and smelled like rain on stone. He stood at the top of the hotel steps for a long moment, his hands in his pockets, watching the black line of cars along the curb. Through the glass doors behind him, the laughter had already moved on. He was not a topic anymore. He was a punchline that had been delivered and retired. The cruelty of it was not the mockery. The cruelty was how quickly the room had forgotten him the moment he walked out. He did not call a taxi. He started walking. Block after block past lit storefronts and closed offices, past a late bar where two men argued over a football score. His coat was thin against the wind, but he did not feel it. He understood with a clarity he had not felt in years that there were only two roads in front of him. The first road was the easy one. He could agree with the room. He could accept that he had tried and failed, that his name was done, that the rest of his working life would be a quiet line of middle jobs in middle offices. He could walk into every future gathering already smaller than the people around him, because a woman in diamonds had told a table of strangers that he did not belong at the top, and the table had agreed. The second road was harder, and it promised nothing. It did not promise revenge. It did not promise that Scarlett would one day stand across from him and understand what she had done. It only promised work, years of it most likely alone, with no audience and no applause. It promised that he would have to start again from something close to nothing. And at the end of that work, there was no guarantee of a different ending, only the chance of one. Adrian stopped at a corner a mile from the hotel. Traffic moved slowly in front of him, headlights washing across the wet street. He made the decision quietly, without ceremony. He was not going to accept the definition she had handed him. He was not going to let a single sentence in a room full of strangers become the last thing said about his life. Whatever came next, he would build it himself from the ground, with both hands. The man who walked the rest of the way home that night was not the same man who had sat down at the table hours earlier. He simply did not know yet how long the distance would be. The first months after the gala were quieter than Adrian had expected. He thought the decision he had made on that street corner would feel like momentum. It did not. It felt like standing at the bottom of a hill in the dark, knowing the hill was there, unable yet to see the shape of it. He paid his rent from a shrinking savings account and kept the heat low in the apartment. He stopped eating out. He made a list of every contact he still had from his old life and began calling them one by one, slow and without expectation. Most calls went to voicemail. The ones that did not went worse. Old partners were cordial for exactly the length of a coffee, then stopped returning messages. A man who had once asked Adrian to join his board 3 years earlier now claimed not to remember his last name. 2 former investors listened politely across a restaurant table, nodded at the right moments, and said they would think about it, meaning they already had. A trade journalist he used to drink with told him, with the kindness of a man delivering bad news cleanly, that his name still carried a shadow in the industry. "People remember the collapse," she said. "They don't remember the reasons." He understood then that the first hill was not a business. The first hill was his own name. He could not raise money, could not find co-founders, could not even book meetings under it. So he stopped leading with his history. When he introduced himself now, he said his name quietly and moved on to the work as quickly as possible. He let people judge the idea before they judged the man. It was a small tactic, but it changed the temperature of the rooms he walked into. To keep the lights on, he took consulting work that would have been beneath him 2 years earlier. He wrote business plans for a dental supply company in New Jersey. He cleaned up the accounting system of a small construction outfit run by a man named Marcus Hale, who drank bitter coffee and paid Adrian in cash at the end of every week. The work was honest and boring. It taught him something he had forgotten during his first rise: how real money actually moved through small American businesses, how tight the margins were, how little help the banks were willing to give people who were not already rich. That was where the idea began. It began at Marcus Hale's kitchen table on a rainy Thursday night, when Marcus asked Adrian why it was that he could build half a neighborhood with his own hands, but could not get a $75,000 line of credit without signing away his house. Adrian did not have an answer that evening. He had an answer a month later, after he had spoken with a dozen more small business owners across 3 states, all saying a version of the same thing. The big financial institutions did not want them. The regional banks did not have the tools. The people in between, contractors, small manufacturers, family-run suppliers, were bleeding out from a wound nobody was treating. The opportunity, when he finally saw it, had the plain clarity of something that had been sitting in the middle of the room all along. He would build a lending platform designed specifically for the businesses the large firms had always considered too small and too slow. He would use technology to make the underwriting faster and the risk more readable. He would price it fairly on purpose, because the market had made a habit of charging these owners a premium for the sin of being modest in size. It was not a glamorous idea. That was precisely why no one had built it. He called the company Keystone. He registered it out of a shared office space above a laundromat where the rent was low and the coffee machine was free. He spent the first 3 months writing code at night and meeting business owners during the day, offering the earliest version of the service at almost no cost, just to prove the model worked. He slept less than he should have. He wore the same 2 shirts in rotation and stopped noticing. The apartment stayed cold, but the small office above the laundromat stayed lit well past midnight, and slowly, in a way he could count the numbers on his screens, began to move. The first real investor he pitched was a man named Richard Bowen, a quiet former banker who had retired early and now put small amounts of his own money into founders he believed in. Adrian did not hide his past this time. He laid it out inside the first 10 minutes of the meeting: the collapse, the mistakes, the partners who had left, the lessons that had followed. Richard listened without interrupting. When Adrian finished, Richard asked only one question. He asked what was different this time. Adrian said that the last time he had built a company for the room he wanted to sit in. This time, he was building a company for the people the room had always ignored. Richard wrote him a check 3 days later. The money was not large. It was enough to hire 2 engineers and pay himself a salary that covered rent and nothing else. But it was the first door that had opened cleanly in almost a year, and it changed the way Adrian walked into every meeting after it. Something in his posture shifted. Not arrogance, he had lost the taste for arrogance. Something steadier. The quiet of a man who had been told he did not belong, and who had stopped asking for permission to sit down. Keystone grew the way slow things grow in America, by word of mouth, through small business networks, through a handful of trade associations that nobody in the glass towers of Manhattan paid attention to. By the end of the first year, the platform had originated loans to over 200 small businesses across 7 states, with a default rate lower than the industry average. By the middle of the second year, a regional bank in Ohio had licensed the underwriting engine. Adrian hired a head of operations, a woman named Claire Whitfield, who had spent a decade at a major firm and left because she was tired of building products nobody but millionaires could use. She took a pay cut to join him. She said it was the first job she had taken where the mission fit in a single sentence. It was around that time that Adrian began to feel the first resistance from above. At a conference in Chicago, a senior executive from Voss Capital approached him at the coffee station and asked with the easy smile of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, whether Keystone would be open to a conversation about a partnership. Adrian kept his face neutral, shook the man's hand, and said politely that Keystone was not looking for partnerships at this stage. The executive smiled a little wider and said that Scarlett Voss liked to know the companies operating in her adjacent markets. He handed Adrian a card. Adrian put it in his pocket, and after the conference, he threw it away. 2 months later, Voss Capital announced its own small business lending initiative. The press release called it a new vertical. The terms were almost identical to Keystone's priced, aggressively lower marketed, with a budget Adrian could not match in a decade. Within a quarter, 3 of the regional banks Adrian had been courting quietly pulled back from their conversations with him. One of them told him off the record that Voss had offered them a bundle they could not ignore. He told the team the next morning in a short meeting in the plain language he had taught himself to use. Voss Capital had entered the market with more money, more reach, and more pressure. Keystone could not compete on price. Keystone could not compete on brand. What Keystone could do was keep building a product that was genuinely better for the customer and hold on to the relationships it already had, while the larger firm tried to buy its way in. He asked the team if they were prepared to work harder for less certainty. Nobody left the room. The next 6 months were the hardest stretch of Adrian's professional life. He cut his own salary by half. He renegotiated every supplier contract. He lost 2 engineers to better-funded competitors, and he hired replacements at slower pay. He spent more nights in airports than in his own bed, flying to small towns he had never heard of, sitting across from business owners in diner booths, explaining in person what a press release could not. Some of them stayed. Some of them left for Voss. The ones who stayed told him they did so because he answered their calls himself, and no one from the other firm ever would. In the middle of all of it, Scarlett's name began to appear in his day in small, precise ways. An article in a business paper quoted her, dismissing the small business lending space as a niche that would consolidate into the hands of serious players within 2 years. A panel at an industry summit featured her talking about how the future of finance belonged to firms with scale and pedigree. He read them in hotel rooms late at night, and each time, the memory of the gala came back not sharp anymore, but clear the way an old scar is clear when you press it. He did not answer any of the articles. He kept working. The mistake came in the spring of the 3rd year. It came not from recklessness, but from exhaustion. A large investor offered Keystone a $40 million growth round at a valuation that would have solved every pressure on the company for at least 18 months. The terms were aggressive, heavy liquidation preferences, a board seat, a clause that gave the investor the right to approve any future financing. Adrian's lawyer advised against it in a 2-page memo that he read twice and then set aside. Claire told him plainly in his office with the door closed that the terms would cost him control the moment the company hit any turbulence. He listened to her. He understood her argument. And then he signed the papers anyway, because he had been running on too little sleep for too long, and because the relief of having money in the account outweighed in that single afternoon the judgment he had spent 3 years rebuilding. The trap sprang 4 months later. A minor downturn in the regional banking sector triggered a covenant in the agreement. The investor, using the clause Claire had warned him about, blocked Keystone from taking on a bridge loan that would have carried it through the quarter. Within 8 weeks, the company was out of operating cash. Payroll was at risk. 2 of the largest regional partnerships went on pause. A reporter from a trade publication called Adrian for comment on rumors that Keystone was preparing to wind down. He told the reporter there was no comment. He hung up the phone, sat in his chair, and did not move for almost an hour. He called an all-hands the following morning. He stood at the front of the small office above the laundromat, and he told the 22 people in front of him the truth. He told them the company had weeks, not months. He told them he had made the wrong call on the financing, and that the mistake was his alone, not Claire's, not theirs. He told them he would keep fighting, but that anyone who needed to look for other work should do so with his full support and a reference in writing. Nobody spoke when he finished. Claire was the first to stand up. She said she would stay as long as the lights were on. One by one, the rest of the room said the same thing. That night, Adrian walked home in the rain. He took the long way past the closed storefronts and the late bars, past the corner where he had made his decision 3 years earlier. He understood, standing there again, that he was in a worse place than he had been on the night of the gala. On the night of the gala, he had lost nothing but his pride. Now there were 22 people whose rent depended on him. Regional business owners who had trusted him with their livelihoods, investors who had written him checks on the strength of his word. The weight of all of it pressed down on his chest in a way that almost made it hard to breathe. He thought for the first time in 3 years about quitting. Not about disappearing, he had never been that kind of man, but about liquidating the company, cleanly paying what could be paid, writing the email that admitted the second failure, and walking away for good this time. He thought about how Scarlett Voss would hear about it. He imagined her reading the headline over coffee, setting the paper down with a small, satisfied expression, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. The cautionary tale had simply added a second chapter. He did not know yet how he was going to get out. He only knew that he had reached the lowest point he had ever stood in, and that the next move was going to have to come from a place he had not yet visited. The rain soaked through his coat. For a long time he stayed where he was, and when he finally walked the last blocks home, he did not feel defeated exactly. He felt emptied, and beneath the emptiness, very faint, something hard and old was beginning to wake up. Adrian slept 4 hours that night and woke before the alarm. The apartment was still cold. He made coffee the way he had made it every morning for 3 years, black in the same chipped mug, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad in front of him. He did not open his laptop. He did not check the overnight messages. He wrote in plain handwriting a single question at the top of the page. What did you actually build this company for? He underlined it once, and then he stared at it for a long time while the coffee cooled in front of him. What came back was not a business answer. It was a memory. It was Marcus Hale at a kitchen table in New Jersey, asking why a man who could build a neighborhood could not get a line of credit. It was a woman outside of Cleveland who had told him at the end of a long meeting that Keystone had been the first lender in 15 years to treat her company like it was worth the paperwork. The company had never really been about the platform, or the valuation, or the press. It had been about those 2 people and several hundred more who looked just like them. Somewhere in the last year, under the pressure of competing with Voss, Adrian had stopped building for them and started building against her. That was the wound. Not the money, not the investor clause, not even the gala. It was that a single sentence from a woman in diamonds had lived inside him for 3 years, shaping decisions he did not realize it was shaping. He had taken the $40 million round because part of him still wanted to prove something to a room he had already walked out of. He had let the shape of her firm dictate the shape of his. The deepest part of the trap had not been set by the investor. It had been set quietly on the night he had walked out of the ballroom and carried her verdict home with him. He set the pen down and sat with that understanding for a long time. Then he picked the pen back up and wrote the plan that would take him through the next year. It was not a glamorous plan. It did not involve a rescue round from a major firm or a clever legal counterattack. It involved going back to the customers one by one and telling them the truth about where Keystone was, and asking them plainly whether they would be willing to prepay on future services at a discount in exchange for keeping the company alive. It involved calling Richard Bowen, the first man who had written him a check, and asking for his help with a restructuring. It involved selling for almost nothing the underwriting license to 2 regional banks in order to raise enough cash to meet the next 2 payrolls. None of it was a breakthrough. All of it was work. He drove himself over the next 3 months through a schedule that stripped everything from his life except the company. He flew coach. He slept in roadside hotels. He sat across from small business owners in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Indiana and asked them to bet on him a second time. Many said no. Enough said yes. Richard Bowen, after Adrian finally called him, organized a syndicate of 3 smaller investors who took over the toxic investor's position at a steep discount, clearing the covenant that had been strangling the company. Claire Whitfield rebuilt the operations team from 22 to 15 and made the 15 move faster than the 22 ever had. By the end of that year, Keystone wasn't dead. It was smaller, it was slower, but it was clean. And something Adrian had not expected began to happen. The small businesses that had stayed with him during the worst months started telling other small businesses what had happened. The story of a lender who had called his customers personally when the company was falling apart, who had offered them discounts instead of excuses, moved through trade associations and family business networks, the way real information moves in America by word of mouth, slowly and with weight. Voss Capital's lending vertical, for all its advertising, could not buy what Keystone was now earning for free. The second year after the crisis, Keystone tripled its loan volume. The third year, it doubled again. Adrian stopped giving interviews about the company because the customers were doing a better job of it than he ever could. Around that same time, Voss Capital began showing its first visible cracks. An analyst report noted that 2 of its newer verticals, an insurance tech platform and a consumer credit arm, were burning through cash at a rate the firm could not sustain. Industry chatter suggested that Scarlett's aggressive expansion into markets she did not understand had stretched the firm thin. Adrian noted these details without comment and returned to his own work. By the 5th year, 3 of the largest community banking networks in the country had licensed Keystone's platform, and a foundation that supported small manufacturers in the Midwest had made Keystone its recommended financial partner. Adrian hired a general counsel, a chief technology officer, a head of policy. He moved out of the office above the laundromat and into a modest floor in a mid-rise building on the edge of the financial district. He still drove the same car. In the 6th year, Voss Capital quietly shut down its small business lending vertical. The press release cited a strategic realignment. The real reason, as Adrian learned from a former Voss employee who came to interview at Keystone, was simpler. The vertical had bled capital for 5 consecutive years, kept alive only by the firm's reluctance to admit a public defeat. The customer acquisition costs were 5 times higher than projected. They had never understood who they were lending to. They had never sat at a kitchen table in New Jersey. Adrian read the news on his phone one afternoon between meetings. He read it once, put the phone face down on his desk, and went back to the document he had been reviewing. The empire was not the word he used for it. He never used that word. But that was the word. The press began to use somewhere around the 7th year when a business magazine ran a cover story about how a quiet lender nobody had heard of 5 years earlier had become the largest underwriter of small manufacturing and construction loans in the country. The article quoted Claire more than it quoted Adrian. It mentioned almost in passing that the founder had once run a company that had collapsed in under 2 years. It mentioned that the trade journal word had once been cautionary. The new word the article said was something else entirely. He almost did not attend the gala that fall. The invitation arrived with the same gold foil at the same hotel for a charity supporting regional economic development. He had a team now that attended these things on his behalf. He had stopped measuring his life by how many ballrooms he was welcome in. But the cause was one Keystone had supported for 3 years, and the board had personally asked him to come. He put on a suit that fit. He took a car into the city and walked through the glass entrance of the Westmore Hotel, without the tightness in his jaw he remembered from the last time. The ballroom had not changed. The same chandeliers hung from the same gold ceiling. The same string quartet played in the corner. The same long tables were set with white linen and low roses. What had changed was the way people turned as he walked in. Conversations dimmed the way conversations dim when a room recognizes a man who has built something it respects. He was shown to a seat near the center of the room at a table with 3 senators, a university president, and the head of a manufacturing council. He saw Scarlett from across the floor during the second course. She was at a smaller table now, further from the center. She was still striking. She still wore black. But there was a stillness around her that had not been there before, the stillness of a woman whose firm had lost one vertical, then another, then a third, and whose name no longer moved a room the way it once had. She was speaking with a man beside her, but her eyes found Adrian across the length of the ballroom, and for a small, exact moment the amusement that had always lived in her face was not there. Something else was in its place. It was not quite regret. It was recognition. She rose from her seat when the dinner moved into its open portion. She crossed the floor the way she had always crossed floors, as if every path through a room had been designed for her. She stopped a few feet from his chair. Adrian set down his water glass and stood. They had not spoken in 7 years. She had never apologized. He had never asked her to. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than he remembered. She said his name, just his first name, the way she had said it in this same room years earlier, but without the edge. She said that she had been watching Keystone for some time. She said that she had been wrong that night about what he was capable of, and that she understood now that she had mistaken quiet for weakness. She said it cleanly, without decoration, the way a person says a thing they have rehearsed in private and decided they would say out loud only once. Adrian listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at her for a long moment, and what he felt was not what he had expected to feel. It was not triumph. It was not anger. It was something closer to nothing at all. Not emptiness, but a calm, even absence, as if a door that had been propped open inside him for 7 years had finally quietly closed. He understood that the version of him that had needed this moment had stopped existing somewhere around the 3rd year, probably at a kitchen table in front of a legal pad, and that the man standing here now had no use for the apology, except to receive it politely. He told her in a voice that did not carry further than the 2 of them that he appreciated her saying it. He told her he hoped her firm found its footing. He did not remind her of what she had said. He did not ask her what had changed. He simply nodded, once the way a man nods when a transaction is complete, and he walked past her toward the conversation waiting for him at his own table. She stood for a moment, where he had left her, and then she returned to her seat. He did not think about her again that night. He sat through the rest of the dinner, listened to the speeches, made the kind of small, useful conversation with the people around him that had become second nature. When the evening ended, he walked out through the same tall doors he had walked out of 7 years earlier. The air outside was cold and smelled like rain on stone, the same way it had smelled that first night. The man who walked down those steps was not the same man who had walked away from that room years earlier, and he was not the same man who had walked in tonight either. The gala had given him something he had not come looking for and had not needed and could now set down. He understood standing there that the real work of the last 7 years had never been about building a company large enough to make Scarlett Voss apologize. The real work had been about building a life in which her apology was no longer necessary. The company had been a byproduct of that. The empire, as the magazines called it, had been a byproduct. He thought as his car pulled up about the people who would hear some version of this story. He thought about the ones who were sitting at the quiet end of a table somewhere tonight, listening to a sentence that was trying to define them. He wanted them to know what he knew now. A single sentence from a stranger in a room full of strangers cannot decide the shape of a life unless the person who heard it agrees to let it. Failure is not a verdict. It is a chapter. The real power in the world is never the power to make another person small. It is the power to build something that did not exist before from nothing with both hands, because you decided it was worth building. And the strongest answer a man can give to the people who laughed at him is not a better laugh. It is a quieter life further down the road, in which their laughter can no longer be heard.